to attend each week. We're kind of getting used to this virtual world, but it's less than ideal, and I think it's pretty isolating. So I really like to use this time to bring in new people and learn new things and get excited about science. So I hope you guys will stick with me through the semester and learn about some really great science. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who is going to introduce this week's speaker. So, Steve, go for it.
Thanks a lot, Amelia. Really appreciate it. I'm very happy to introduce our guest for this first seminar in the series, Dr. Bonnie McCay. Bonnie is a professor emerita from the Rutgers University College of Human Ecology, where she spent virtually all of her career. Bonnie's got a BA in anthropology from Portland State and her Master's of Philosophy and Doctor of Philosophy in anthropology from Columbia. If you Google her CV, it's extensive, and it really is reflective of a career well lived in terms of a type of professional career that we all aspire to. And I'd encourage people, particularly the young folks, to do that. She has extensive experience in anthropological studies related to natural resource management, both at, I would call, the industrial scale, large scale fisheries of, very sophisticated things, and also looking at what we would call artisanal scale fisheries. And I know she observes artisanal fisheries from her summer home on Fogo Island in Newfoundland, right? I'd call her the Margaret Mead of fisheries, actually. She's very extensive and well published in this arena. Just a note on some of the awards that Bonnie has gotten over her career. She's the simultaneous fellow in 3 major societies, including the Society for Applied Anthropology, the American Fisheries Society, and she's an elected AAAS fellow. In 2012, she was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and I wanted to point out one award that she got that really is quite prestigious, and that is, not that the other ones aren't, but she's the recipient of the Eleanor Ostrom Award for Collective Governance in the Commons. And Eleanor Ostrom is a Nobel Prize winner who received that award for her work in what we would call the tragedy of the commons, or common property resources. And to have that award, I think, is quite prestigious. Most recently, she's chaired a National Academy study on the use of limited access privilege programs, or so-called LAPs, in mixed fisheries. And the type example, of course, is red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico. She's been my personal friend and colleague for over 30 years. We've worked on a number of things together, and I'm just really pleased to introduce Bonnie McCay as our speaker today.
Thank you very, very much, Steve. I appreciate the introduction and so forth. I'm not sure about the Margaret Mead thing, but I don't know if you've looked at her biography. But anyway,
Oops.
actually. So I'm really happy to be here with you all and this seminar. And I have to say that I had a wonderful time with many of the graduate students an hour ago. And I was quite impressed by the range, but also the excitement and the obvious dedication they're bringing to their careers in the marine arena. And I wish them all the very best. I've come to this as an outsider in a way, because I was a social scientist coming into a field that is pretty much dominated by people who are so-called natural scientists and physical scientists. And but my inclinations were to be friends with all. So I've tried to maintain that sense of friendship and collegiality in my career, in which I've had the privilege of working with very, very many wonderful people, and mostly in fisheries. Steve is one of them. We're among the veterans of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee. And So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that we both lived through the clam process. Anyway, I have a PowerPoint about 3 cases that I guess I've studied the most. I've been the most personally involved with 3 case studies, each one of which is somewhat extensive over a period of years in 3 different places. And so let me get my little PowerPoint up, and I will introduce that to you. There we go. That looks like it. Nope. Do you see the one that says the use of limited access privilege programs?
We see the one that says catch shares and environmental change case studies.
Oh, very good. Okay, that's appropriate. Thank you. So, a catchy term in marine fisheries is the catch share, and it's used for a wide variety of circumstances. And I'm going to be talking about, I guess I'm kind of bending the concept a bit, but I'm going to talk about the 3 cases that I'm studying in terms of the kinds of catch shares that they represent, and the question of the extent to which and whether that makes a difference to their ability to respond effectively to environmental changes. And so the big question is, how will a catch share based system, however it might be defined, respond to environmental change? And I'm posing 2 questions. You may have heard the concept of foxes in the hen house. And there's a concern that that when you have the foxes in the hen house, the hens may not fare very well. And one of the criticisms of at least one of the types of catch share programs I'm going to talk about, the ITQ or the LAP program that Steve referred to, is one where you're introducing foxes into the hen house. And the question is, if you do that, are they better stewards? Do they take better care of the hens? Or is it just business? So I found this cartoon, which seems to capture the thing very appropriately. And that is, so there are 2 foxes that made it into the hen house. And they remember when there were a large number of them and they were crowded into one room, and now there are only 2 left. And look at how they're doing well by that hen, by the last hen. All right, and this reflects on the one type of catch share program that was the focus of the study that Steve referred to, that we did red snapper and the grouper tilefish, the reef fisheries of the Gulf, among others, and looking at how the LAP programs interacted with other fisheries and the multiple use fisheries. And the notion that the ITQ version of a LAP is one that reduces the number of foxes, as it were. And the question is that very good for the hens? And the background is some sea changes I've seen in fisheries science and policy. And one is, of course, the focus on conservation with diversity and ecological health as major criteria for understanding the goals of conservation. The notion of ecosystem-based management. Another one, and not everybody would agree to this, but that there seems to have been science has taken a humbler role, given the high levels of uncertainty and variability, certainly in marine systems. And that means also the recognition that fishermen and others have knowledge that is relevant. They have expertise that is relevant, that they can be involved in co-production of knowledge and can collaborate in research. And a third one, which is a focus of this talk, is the trend toward reliance on privatized allocation of the right to fish. And this is appearing in the individual transferable quotas, or ITQs, that became established in the US in the early 1990s, as well as other catch share systems. And I will refer to a so-called concession system in Mexico. And then the fourth is simply the recognition of the importance of human dimensions in marine fisheries science and policy. and recognizing the roles of people in 3 different ways. And I think as natural scientists, you're most accustomed to roles of people as the sources of the trouble, the anthropogenic forces that have shaped very, very profoundly all aspects of our natural and cultural world and social world. And then there is the one that social scientists focus on a great deal, and that is people as the ones who have to pay the costs of both the decline in ecosystem services and also regulatory interventions, the social impacts dimension of things. And the third one, the one to which I'm most interested in this case, is people as active participants and witnesses to what's going on. And they are responding to signals of system change. They're providing feedbacks. They're the sources of knowledge and expertise. They're decision makers and actors. So they're part of the system, and important parts of the system, not just as causes of stresses, of overuse and so forth, but as participants in it. And so I'm going to be looking at 3 different kinds of cat share programs, or as a way of talking about fisheries management. And one is the more classic type with a government that has mandates that it applies. It may be consultative. People who are involved in it and other stakeholders may be involved and have some advisory capacity. But essentially, the decisions are made at the very top and then applied down below, a hierarchical system. Another one is either separate from that or within that, the individual transferable quota, where participants in the fishery no longer have relatively open access, but instead must obtain the right to fish, and that right to fish in some way is transferable. It brings the market into management decision making in a new way that is believed to help reduce some of the diseconomies of traditional management, of the top-down government mandated form that might say you can only take so much fish, but then that can create disincentives for wise economic management and even need disincentives for compliance. And then the third type, which is not as often referred to as a cat share, is one where a community is involved, a community of sorts is involved in management and manages its share of resource. So I have 3 case studies that I'm used to reflect on these types of management. One is in Canada, and it's mostly about cod, Atlantic cod. Second one is in the east coast of the US, and it's for surf clams and ocean quahogs. And the third one is in Mexico, and that's for lobster and abalone and some other species. And the question is this one about what difference does this cat share type of management make to their capacity to deal with environmental change? And I grew up academically at the time when cybernetics was still rather popular. And so I'm using the notions of negative and positive feedback, or deviation amplifying and deviation mitigating correctives, thinking of regulatory system, a thermal regulatory system, if you would. And so if there's a deviation in the system, then your responses make the deviation worse, complex, or more complicated? Or do they actually mitigate? Do they correct the deviation? So the question is, well, what happens when things go wrong with fisheries, and what do people do? The management systems themselves, the people involved, what do they do? And so I'm using the cat share thing to think about this in terms of these 3 different fisheries, ITQs, which is a real privatization of certain kind of right to fish, and these community shares, whereby many of the management functions are decentralized, and given to smaller, in these cases, community-based cooperatives to make key decisions about the management of the resources. And then the third one is the more traditional one, the top-down consultative one. And so case 1 is this last, and it's about the tragedy of the Northern Cod Commons. This is seen often as a classic example of the tragedy of the commons, where open access results in overuse of the resource and eventually the tragedy of tremendous loss. In this case, loss of not just the right to fish, but loss of jobs, loss of income, and a major change in an ecosystem. This occurred in the large marine ecosystem of the Newfoundland Labrador Shelf, and it's fairly far north, and being also in the Western Atlantic, has sharply seasonal fishing seasons. It's surrounded by, the area is surrounded by ice for much of the year, and so it's a very challenging and interesting fishery. So this is what happened. You may be familiar with this. Is one portrayal of the workings of this tragedy, where the landings, and this combines non-Canadian landings and Canadian, two types, inshore or fixed gear and mobile. And there's telling a lot of stories. One story there is talking about the expansion of the foreign fishery off in that area in the the 1960s in particular, into the 70s. And there was a real decline in the cod in response to massive overfishing. And you can see that in the dip in the 1970s. Then gradual recovery, but then further decline. And then it ended in 1992. It virtually ended in 1992. That's called a collapse. If you ever want to know what a fisheries collapse was, this is a collapse. What happened in 1992 was that the Canadian government declared a moratorium on the cod fishery, entire moratorium on the cod fishery, and what remained of the International Association made agreements also to cut way back on the cod. So I've learned about it through the perspective of the inshore fishery, particularly that of Fogo Island, Newfoundland. And here you see a range of some of the boats. The more modern boats, actually. There's a little tiny one that you'll see next to the green boat. That's one of the traditional, truly artisanal boats. And this is, I think, one of the most poignant representations of what fishery collapse could be. This is the echogram of the last large spawning aggregation known of the northern cod in 1992 that George Rose recorded. So basically, the fish was virtually gone. It was nearly extinct. Okay, so what happened? All right, so there were problems. Fishery was, the inshore fishery experienced many years where they couldn't catch very many fish, and the offshore fishery did that, but also the offshore fishery developed technology to adapt to that. There was a decline in abundance, but also the size of fish over the 1980s, and the offshore developed more ice-worthy boats and found the winter spawning grounds of cod. And so they were able to make up for decline in other grounds and other seasons, and maintain a pretty healthy fishery by hitting those spawning grounds. Processing companies adapted with changing their filleting machines for smaller fish. The cod traps were adapted to be able to catch the fish, more fish than the cod traps, even though they were small, and so on and so forth, and so forth. And what happened was the quotas that were set were routinely higher than the catches were. And there were people saying, "Wait, we got to do something about this." There was even a lawsuit attempting on the part of the inshore fishers to stop it. Scientists were some of them were speaking out about it, but the decision was basically to continue to allow the fishery to take place at a higher level than actually they could meet, and ignore some of the scientific reports, particularly concerned about retrospective bias in the data, and so forth. And there are other reasons going on for the decision makers in the capital, in Ottawa, to decide not to reduce, seriously reduce the fishery in sign of real trouble. So that's deviation amplification. People themselves had to make do afterwards. They went on welfare, they left, they retired, they got involved in tourism. They also shifted, they shifted to fishery for snow crabs and shrimp, which involved totally different technology, and many fewer people could be involved in that kind of fishery, and basically made a significant change to the way of life and quality of life in Newfoundland. there is more I could say about all of that, but basically the whole economic and social system was transformed by this. There was a small recovery and it was noted by George Rose in 2015 when he found some significant columns of spawning. And that was very exciting to see that. And there was other evidence suggesting that the cod populations were on the road to recovery, and there was actually a good sign of capelin, which is a major food for cod in that region. So it was quite exciting. But the situation now is still one of a very, very weakened fish stock and a totally transformed way of life. So it's deviation amplification in my simplistic cybernetic terms, a historic pattern of responding to decline in evidence, such as catch per unit effort, by intensifying the effort, missing cues, and responding inappropriately in a situation where there was really poor feedback to what people were doing individually at the local level, partly because the fish itself is very broad range and migratory. But there was little protection from the politics of the situation. And of course, people were very, very dependent on fishing and employment from fishing. So that seemed to trump, and the big corporations the government had been supporting for some time. And so that those trumped and efforts on parts of some of the scientists to get a much lower quota. Second, so case number 2. This is a more positive one. This is about a catch share that where in a sense the catch share is afforded to communities through rules that give to cooperatives, fishing cooperatives in Mexico, exclusive privileges to certain species. The study is done in Baja California, the central part of Baja California, in the state of Baja California Sur, and this diagram on the on your right shows the number of cooperatives, fishing cooperatives along that coast. It's a desert coast. It's a part of the California current, so it's also a highly productive marine ecosystem. The fishery, as you can see from the left, is what you would call a small-scale or artisanal fishery. So those cooperatives are part of a federation of cooperatives, 2 federations of cooperatives, and these and those squares there refer to concessions that are given, territorial concessions afforded to each of the cooperatives for exclusive use for abalone fishing and for lobster fishing. This shows you the desert itself and the artisanal fishery, very, very, very poor living in these communities. But the fishermen are doing very well. They often have homes in other communities as well, because they've been able to succeed quite nicely in managing their spiny lobster fishery. And then down below you see a kind of chart that you don't often see in fisheries these days. This is the kind of catches, live weight catches over time, and the income in dollars. And but it's the catches themselves was both catch of live weight and income in dollars. I'm not sure. I guess the income in dollars is the little dashed part of it. I'm sorry. And so this has been a remarkable case of actually increased effort and increased catches over quite a long period of time. And there's a complicated story about that. Abalone is the second major fishery that's handled in these concession systems. Now, abalone, as you know, are much threatened, and throughout the world, this is one of the last places that has any kind of a viable commercial abalone, legal commercial abalone fishery. These cooperatives, some of them, they struggle a great deal with the abalone. But the production for the lobster is rather impressive. This is for all the federation of the cooperatives entirely up through the early 2000s, and showing this. And it's because of this and because of the efforts of people in these fishing cooperatives and scientists and NGOs that the Marine Stewardship Council gave to these cooperatives certification for their spiny lobster fishery. And they've renewed that certification several times. I have details on the actual management of the fisheries. The point is that general point is that, yes, it is still a top-down system in Mexico, but these cooperatives have been able to achieve a great deal of semi-autonomy and have a lot of decision-making power in cooperation with a kind of negotiation with the government agents in the region. So the cooperatives have both general requirements, regulatory measures, and they also they have some of their own regulatory measures. And they are very, of course, many fisheries have the same regulatory measures. These cooperatives are also unusual in actually being able to enforce them very well. So management involves both a combination of the limits on entry. It's very hard to become a lobster fisherman or an abalone fisherman in these cooperatives. You have to go through an apprenticeship program and agree to all kinds of the regulations and other conditions. And there is really strict delineation of the fishing areas. The territories are very, very well known and defended. And then there are community-based measures to make sure people regulate themselves. And we've written a great deal about this. In so many ways, this remains a kind of an ideal case of what Eleanor Ostrom wrote about in her discussion of small-scale community-based management of the commons. So these were the officials of the cooperative are elected. They're all fishermen who are elected. There are no outsiders who are officials, except for a biological technician, and they are elected for 4-year periods, and then somebody else has to replace them. They cannot stay in office, so they try to maintain. Everybody has a chance to and an obligation to be an officer. Everybody has an obligation to and a chance to be involved in enforcement as well. And these seem to work remarkably well. They also offer retirement benefits to members of the society and health benefits too, to help supplant rather meager government resources. And it's very much a community thing, so that here the parade celebrates the fishery as well, and the football teams and so forth are all, and baseball team rather, is all organized around the fisheries. Now they've also, not only have they done pretty well, they've also managed to experiment with doing better. So they've experimented with no-take marine reserves within their territories, their concessions. And the one that's best known is the Isla Natividad. And my colleagues in this research project included Theo Michelli from Stanford University, who also has headed up a study of work with the fishermen there and in monitoring this no-take reserve, and found out that when they had major anoxic events back in when was that? 2018-19, in that area, tremendous die-offs. The members of the cooperative were able to see that their no-take abalone reefs had done better than the other abalone reefs in recovery from the anoxic assault. So the people are involved themselves in monitoring. They dive to and they're trained to do it in a scientific way. The cooperative members are very involved in every aspect of that and more generally of the fishery. So it's a really amazing story, and it's a famous story now. And they have a kind of co-management as well as self-management. So they work with the government, but they also do a lot on their own. And but it's really important to understand that here and elsewhere, you're talking about larger systems, a larger political, legal, and social system. And also, people involved in this are not just the fishermen. There are all kinds of NGOs involved in it, and researchers, and the markets are really important, and the Marine Stewardship Council. So, and there's a longer story of the history of it, about how these cooperatives came to be as they are and why they're so successful. All of that is important in understanding who they are, which is a kind of an advertisement for social sciences and historians in marine fisheries. So here we could, looking at that case, we could think about tipping points or opportunities to take stock, to learn, to make changes. And that's really important, I think, in understanding how we respond to climate change, to other environmental changes that are occurring, and then to find ways to make things better. So we can adapt by getting by, diversifying and so forth, searching for new grounds. We can actually try to improve the situation. And the Mexican case is one of efforts to improve things by experimenting at least with no-take reserves. So the next one I'll talk about, the third one, is the surf clam and ocean quahog system, which in a way has a potential for doing some mitigation in the face of very clear signals of major climate change in the ocean. So this is the US surf clam and ocean quahog case. This is a very different marine system, the temperate system influenced by the Gulf Stream. The clams are, of course, benthic resources. And then, I mean, there is a benthic story here, by the way. If we back up to the Mexican case, the fact we're talking about benthic organisms means that we're talking about systems where you can use territorial controls to some effect. But this is also quite different in that it's highly industrialized with the vertical integration that is involved in having boats that are owned by processors, and some of the processors might have ownership links to distributors and so forth. So there are some big companies involved in it, as well as small companies, and there are a few cases of people, just individuals owning boats. It's been quota managed since 1978. One of the first fisheries after the law of the sea and the U.S. Magnuson Act was passed to have such management. And it's the first fishery in the United States to be managed with individual transferable quotas. So it's an industrialized system. It goes all the way through capture to processing in plants, and then into cans that you may know and love as clam chowder and clam sauce. And the research that I was involved in was a large interdisciplinary one that involved people in a variety of universities with a lot of different backgrounds, and people in the U.S. Fishery Management, Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and members of industry as well, all pictured below. And of course, myself talking to fishermen. And this is hardly artisanal. These are large-scale vessels and operations using the hydraulic dredge system. And so the question was, well, they're now being affected by climate change. Some warming seems to be making a difference to the survival and growth of clams in the southern areas. And so how is the industry, what are the effects of this on the industry, and how are they responding to it? And it's important to recognize that this is even, by now, certainly after ITQs began in 1990, this is a highly consolidated industry, a lean and mean one. There are very few people involved in it anymore. There are relatively few boats. And there's now a well-developed history of industry-sponsored research and co-management. It's also a case where the signs of environmental change, the effects on the clams, are pretty clear, and if not understood, at least accepted by people at all levels. So I guess the big question is, can this system, this industry, and a science-based regulatory system adjust in appropriate ways to the effects of this? And so this is for the ecosystem modelers out there. Here's the model that we used, at least the model used for thinking in our study of how climate forcing and effects of changes in that, and genetics and so forth, and the population source sink dynamics, and how that feeds into the assessment model, and looking at the regulatory side and the fisheries themselves, and then the interactions there. So our fairly large project tried to work within this framework to understand what had happened and what was going on. So the ITQs created a real decline, as I've mentioned, in the fishery, and in terms of fleet tonnage, which was an important thing. In other words, there was what economists would call overcapitalization run amok in this case, because the management system was based upon limiting the amount of time a boat could go fishing. And so people would have as many boats as possible to maximize the amount of time they had in the water, basically. And each boat was not limited in terms of the number of clams. So if they could, and they were allowed indirectly to expand the size of boats, they would do that. So all of that was going on in the later 1980s, leading up to the choice to go to ITQs, whereby they could then consolidate the number of boats because they didn't have to deal with this archaic system of requiring that each boat had only a certain amount of time it could be in the water. And with that came the consolidation of ownership that was also expected as people bought each other out. And this is one of the things that is expected in an ITQ system, and by some hoped for and others not, because it also suggests that some people are being squeezed out, and that may be done in an unfair way. Talking about this, I often think about the major competing paradigms. We have this notion, from economics, you have these clear straight lines and kind of at least understandable arcs. And this is the classic one to explain why one would want to have a more economically rational system of management of fisheries. And then on the right is a vision of the Atlantic jacuzzi, the southeast of Cape Cod, the median of the Gulf Stream, the Labrador Current. This is from 1991. But anyway, showing the more chaotic and dynamic system. And one wonders about privatized catch shares and how they fit in with ecosystem management, because they're commodity oriented. They're linked to marketable commodities, so the signals are coming from the markets. They're often single species, and they have bycatch problems, or they may. The market signals are not ones usually giving long-term horizons; they're short-term horizons. And there's, in these privatized systems, a much narrower community of interest, because those who own shares become the significant private decision-making community. On the other hand, it's a more bottom-up system in a way, because it's giving more decision-making control to the owners of these rights to share in the annual quota. And there are incentives to collaborate that come about through the ownership of shares and the possibility of having longer-term interests, interests in the long term. And so partnerships in science have actually come out of this program. Important partnerships in scientists with real potentials for genuine stewardship and a kind of ownership that would involve taking greater care of the resource. And so we've had outcomes. We've had real cooperative research programs that have been used for the stock assessments. And this is showing Eric Powell, who was at Rutgers at the time of this picture, is now at South Mississippi, and with one of the clam boat owners involved in cooperative research. We know now that the surf clam is no longer overfished, is not overfished, nor is overfishing taking place, but the catch per unit effort is going down fast and clams are dying. And so they've got clear signals of change. This is showing you, this is a rather popular map to show you on the top, in terms of the amounts of clams that are being caught, in particular 10-mile squares, the more southern nature of the fishery and the die-off of clams in the southern region correlated with rising ocean temperatures. And so what clammers were doing by the time we were doing the research was they were focusing on 2 10-minute squares, especially one, 3973, which accounted for 50% of the landings of surf clams. So the clammers were doing the kind of logical short-term thing, moved to and concentrated on more abundant spots, even though there's a decline in average catch rates. Okay, well, that's well and good. So what? The stock assessment showed very low fishing mortality overall. The ACL, the quota, is way below the allowable biological catch. But one of our research suggested that there was some problem going on in that climate forcing is happening at one end, and then something else was happening at the more northern end, constricting the range of successful clam recruitment. In other words, the clam recruitment could kind of may have gone down in the south, but maybe it's going up and further north. And so we hypothesized that the clams, the surf clam, was in a situation of being in a jam, clams in a jam. And so we did a study of what was happening with the Hudson Canyon region and so forth, and found barriers to larval flow and settlement, at least modeled that, and so forth. So the situation where the clams seem to be in a jam, they're not necessarily moving for further north, and the fishery is concentrating on one or two small areas of really high abundance, which may be really critical sources for recruitment of clams. In other words, they're focusing on the golden eggs. And so the question is, well, what could be done? And so one of them is don't worry about it, just accept the losses and maybe go into plastics or something after that. Second one is to change your behavior and move to more abundant clam beds. Well, in that region, there were no more abundant clam beds, or fish more intensively, and that's what they did. Or switch to ocean quahogs. Well, the value wasn't so high and it wasn't very attractive. Other species, not really. The setup technology is quite different. Industry reorganization, yes, they shifted the processing northward, and yes, buyouts and consolidation. What about finding another place to catch clams above this place where there's a barrier? And we knew there are clams on George's Bank, but there's a PSP problem, a toxin that has kept the fishery closed. And consider some other measure, perhaps rotating the use of these highly abundant places or closing them for a while, protecting them, because the scallop fishery, which is well known in that area, has had a successful rotational program. So these were all possibilities. And what seemed to be happening, certainly when we did finish the study, was that they were pretty much crowding in the favored spots. It was a lot of conflict, actually. There was discussion of rotation and limiting catches on the hot spots. Re-review of the stock assessments, saying, well, wait a minute here. It says that no overfishing is going on, but that's because we're looking at the whole big range of the stock. But if we began to look at the actual, kind of the topography of the stock, the topology of the stock, we could see that overfishing may be going on in important ways to sources versus sinks, and thinking about it differently. But what happened? Well, happily for the industry, in 2013, the industry was able to work out with the government ways to protect the consumer from the toxins of PSP and open George's Bank. So the new source of surf clams was opened up, and the industry has since then been preoccupied with maintaining access to the clams. And that's partly because of now New England Council has more protected habitat areas, and there's been wind energy development. So this is what's going on. But the industry has also been very much involved in cooperative research, and a lot of that's taking place through Eric Powell's group in southern Mississippi, funding research to examine these problems for the industry. And this is just showing the movement into George's Bank. On the right is showing you the hotter spots now for clamming is up on the George's Bank. So that kind of resolved the problem of overfishing in the lower area. But this also brought to mind, well, what are the institutional challenges to responding appropriately to environmental change? And we've got all kinds of things in our legislative system, the Magnuson-Stevens Act included. You know, the way we think about overfishing and overfish, the kinds of stock assessment models we have. We also have the overburdened organizations involved, the scientific and management organizations. There's only so much that they can do. See, the time we finished the study, there was talk about abandoning the surf plan stock assessment. And then there's also been the elevation of a more precautionary way of dealing with fisheries management, elevating, you know, scientific uncertainty, and that can have an effect on the kinds of things that can be done. The quota setting process itself takes time, so you can't immediately make changes. And in the Mid-Atlantic, there's a 3-year framework. And but is it this one about this assumption about spatial homogeneity and stock assessments is really important, and that's understanding the stock throughout its range and using that to assess whether something is being overfished. There's a lag in the survey data. I mentioned that already. And then there are the ITQs. And this industry, once the ITQs were in place, the industry pretty much adopted a position of no change, status quo. And one of the reasons for that is their market situation, because they're competing globally, and they can lose buyers to other sources of clams from other countries if they show any sign that there's a possibility that there will be a reduction in the supply that they can provide at a certain price. So they are extremely, extremely careful about no rocking the boat. And this, I think, is one of the real challenges of trying to use ITQs and at the same time desiring a more responsive, let's say, ecosystem sensitive means of management. So, just quickly summing up, okay, enclosing the commons takes place in different ways, different cat share programs. We've had the Newfoundland case with this, and the cod moratorium became a kind of enclosure of the commons, and there's been a lot of change going on that I wouldn't have time to talk about in the other fisheries, including regime shifts, massive regime shifts, ecological. And in Mexico, these exclusive territorial concessions to some communities and the ITQs, they've all responded in crises, mainly by good old muddling through, you know, not making major changes, doing little incremental this and that and so forth within specific contexts and given with specific histories and people involved. I didn't mention the nature, you know, the people are really important, the individuals and their personalities and their commitments and so forth, and the other assets that are brought to the table. And I think the nature of the cat shares has made some difference. Certainly the ITQs are lean and mean, make the fishery much leaner and meaner, easier to organize and higher motive to do so. And we've seen this through our committee in the Gulf of Mexico too, in the workings of the ITQ fisheries and the appearance of shareholders organizations that actually are able to be very effective in using the law and politics and council engagement in the council to help protect their interests. And these so-called TERFs, or territorial use rights fisheries, like the ones in Mexico, are more complicated. They have a lot of support of the community, which is really important. And I note that the vigilantes, they use the term vigilante for their enforcement capacity. And it is really important that they are prepared to enforce their own boundaries, because they cannot count on Mexican police or Navy to do so. They're a very isolated area, and so forth. The poaching is extremely important problem for them. But in all these cases, much else matters in terms of the actual political, legislative context, the nature of the ecosystems themselves, the nature of the fish stocks and so forth, and the people involved. So thank you very much for listening to this. welcome your comments or questions.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie. Much appreciated. We'll give you the equivalent of an applause here. Certainly, we've got a few minutes for questions, and I'm sure Bonnie would be happy to.
Steve, can I interrupt and just
Yes,
ask about if you can call on students first?
Certainly. So I would ask our students to step forward, either raise your hand, electronically, or speak, and let's have your questions. As our students are contemplating their questions, maybe I can serve up a couple. I have a whole notepad of things I came up during your talk, and perhaps we can kind of get things going. So with respect to the last case study you showed on surf clams and quahogs, something I'm somewhat familiar with, you showed the more recent maps of the migration of the fishery, and in looking at the maps of the proposed wind farms that are springing up all along the mid-Atlantic coast, what do you see as the interactions between these two large industries and whether or not they can actually be compatible?
Yes, it's not a pretty picture. It's right now it's one of intense conflict, and RODA is an RODA is an organization that the fishing industries have all collaborated to form, to work supposedly to work together with, as well as in opposition to the developers, to try to make sure that the interests of fisheries are respected. And the last I've learned that the clam industry is really very upset that they have not been consulted about their needs for dredge, for a lot of clear area for dredging. And so what they're doing is they're working together with the other fisheries, particularly the draggers, the clammers and the draggers. The scalpers are the ones most affected, because they also need a lot of room, and they need to have access to a safe bottom without structures and lines and cables and so forth. And so it's a serious problem in the Northeast, a very serious problem for all the fisheries.
So, there is a fairly well-developed governance system on the fisheries side, but there doesn't seem to be a mechanism to adjudicate competing interests, outside the fisheries sector. And what does this say about the development of governance in the long term?
Yes, it is. It unfortunately says that the whole thing then devolves to politics, and which is particularly messy way of doing things, but to politics and the law. Now, BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is trying to find some way to get people to work together, but they have no authority to do so. So it is a problem. There have been there have been episodes in which there have been regional planning bodies formed, but they've never gained true, even though they might have had executive orders behind them, they've never gotten true legislative status to give them authority to help make hard decisions for ocean planning. So I think that's the direction it has to go in, but there has not been much progress in that regard.
Right. Certainly an issue that's going to come to its head, is this sort of unconstrained development in wind power.
Some
really.
States are trying to. It may take states to act up more. The state of Maine has tried to expand their jurisdiction for this purpose anyway, and to have more of a say of what's going on in the Gulf of Maine. And Massachusetts is trying to, I think, step up to the plate too, although they already have tremendous interest in wind energy. the states are torn. But that's where I think important decision making is taking place.
Other questions, Chris Stallings?
Hi, thank you. And I think you touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious about your opinion about individual, like small, truly individual ITQs to the small fisher versus these coalitions that are sometimes formed, and how they then, you know, have a greater buying power, and how that might play into ITQs looking into the future.
So, so you're referring to, like, let's say in the Gulf, some fishermen who have red snapper ITQ, right?
That's right. Yeah, like there's a in the Gulf, there's the Reef Fish Shareholders Alliance, and it's you know, part of their goal is to, you know, since the little guys we're going to get such a small share based on the historical catch, they kind of group together to get a bigger total share.
Right, right. And that's the kind of thing that's really important to have evolved, because it's the problem is that they know very well that big guys can take over. I mean, it's there is a limit in the management system there of how much anyone can hold, but it's not clear who anyone is. You know what I mean? That you don't know for sure who's owning what, because of the nature of the decision, the record keeping.
Right, right, exactly.
But the reef shareholders are trying really hard to at least counter that by finding a way to protect the interests of the smaller shareholders. And that did not happen in the Mid-Atlantic case at all. And it should have happened, because but anyway, it simply didn't happen. So the Mid-Atlantic case became a kind of a poster child for the evils of ITQs. It was used because very quickly a few companies seemed to emerge as the winners, and a lot of the small boat owners disappeared totally, or their boats did, and so and so I think that's why, for example, New England was definitely against any kind of ITQs, because
right, yeah,
they feel about that, right?
Yeah, that definitely seems to be one of the biggest pushbacks that, you know, it's not my area of expertise, but that seems to be one of the biggest pushbacks when, you know, among the smaller groups, and understandably so.
Yeah, no, it is. And this is, I mean, their committee report reflected on some aspects of that. We didn't go into great detail, but we were really concerned about how the initial allocations are made. And so, you know, the system, which is so critical, it sets up the initial generation, anyway, of the distribution of wealth, and how, you know, it's based upon the history of a vessel. The vessel owner is the only one who gets the allocation, et cetera, et cetera. The captain who works for the allocation, works for the history of the vessel, doesn't get anything. The crew don't get anything, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that kind of thing going on. And then other criteria that are used to, besides who they are, but other criteria that are used in that initial allocation. And that kind of poisons the well if one is interested in a more equitable distribution. But then the issue of equity comes up, because people will say, well, it's only fair if those who worked hard to create this fishery are the ones who get the rewards. And
yeah, good point.
Of working hard is usually investing capital versus actually working on the boat.
Yeah, we don't necessarily give the coal mines to the coal miners, right?
No, we just don't do that kind of thing. And we heard in our committee meeting, we heard from one of the guys in Alaska who's been very eloquent about that particular problem. That labor is definitely undervalued in fisheries management decision making. and certainly for ITQs.
Well, thank you.
So can we coax one of our students to ask a question? Everybody seems to be a little shy, first seminar out of the box here. So I have one more question, Bonnie, and that relates to one of the first slides you put up. You were sort of going over what you perceived as mega trends in fisheries management, and one of them that you mentioned that I wrote down was the increasing humility of the system. And I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit, given the fact that you were there at the creation of Magnuson and have seen it through the lens of these other fisheries in other places. How does that humility reflect in terms of actual policy?
I'm trying to think of what I had in mind when I wrote that. Yeah. Well, it certainly is. I guess I see it. I've seen it through the SSC process, the Scientific and Statistical Committee, and the Stock Assessment Workshop process, where the very earnest efforts to identify the weaknesses in the science, but to engage the industry and other onlookers in that process to see what's going on and ask questions about it. So this part of it is the humility is involved in letting others look in while we try to identify the strengths and weaknesses of our arguments and provide some tools to others as well to join us in doing that. So I've seen that, certainly I've seen that in the SERVCLAM process. But in Newfoundland, well, humility was kind of forced upon the scientists involved with the government because they came out of that looking pretty bad, and they finally had to defend themselves, but they did so by pointing to the real faults, the real problems in their science, and had to have the nerve to come out with that and to publish. You may remember some of that, and to recognize that there are some fundamental errors that they've made and that they continue to make, the kind of reproducing errors, such as the retrospective bias type of thing. And so the humility comes in part, what I've seen anyway, is recognizing that, being transparent about it to some degree, and then engaging others. And Trollgate is the other one that I have in mind.
You had to bring that one up, huh?
Yeah, I had to bring it up, but I'll just let that one drop right there. Okay. But yeah, so yeah.
So our dean, Tom Fraser, is raising her hand. You may know Tom. He's the chair of the Gulf Council as well.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the talk. Thanks for being here, Bonnie. So, the focus obviously has been on commercial fisheries, and one of the key drivers of the ITQ or the IFQ programs is overcapitalization, right? And so as we continue to grow as a population and we continue to have more and more individuals vested in the recreational industry, how do you think that we might deal with that problem that's inherently overcapitalized?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how we deal with that problem because our committee grappled with with that, a little bit of that, as you know, and made some suggestions about ways that at least some people involved in the recreational fisheries could take up a combination of privilege and responsibility in making decisions, and others would have to agree to those decisions, that kind of thing. And but that's seems to be quite a long distance from anything that's reasonable right now. You know, I mean, the other way is to go ahead and privatize it. You know, do it the way of the salmon rivers of Scotland. You know, where only the lairds can fish, type thing. And I don't think that's going to go over very well. But it's finding the in-between, as always, is the problem. Okay, it's the same thing with commercial fishing. Finding the in-between between extreme privatization, which means you marginalize or shut out lots of people and create other problems, and an open free-for-all, and finding something and or relying the government to do its job. And that's what we do with recreational. We rely on government, but government can't do so in the United States anyway, and other democratic countries, without reflecting the interests of the political interests of those involved. So it's a real hassle. But finding something in between, a kind of a community-based thing, something that creates a sense of shared privilege and responsibility.
I appreciate the care with which you took to provide that answer. But I like Steve. I have a long list, and it'd be worth a conversation one day offline for sure.
Okay.
Sounds good. I'll give one more opportunity for students, if there are some or is one that would like to ask Bonnie a question. If not, it's getting on to happy hour, and certainly appreciate very much Bonnie being willing to spend her time with our students beforehand, and a great seminar, really a reflection on the course of fisheries management as it's occurred in Magnuson. So again, thank you so much, Bonnie, and I'll give you an ovation. And perhaps Amelia would like to talk a little bit about next week's seminar as well.
Thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me. And I have to say that the students asked really searching, profound questions already, and I've already bet they've grilled me totally.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Bonnie. That was a great talk, and thank you to all the students who participated. There will also be a meeting with next week's speaker at 2 p.m. next Friday. So please join and get to know people and use this professional development opportunity. So thank you, Bonnie. If we can all give her a round of applause, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.